Hello and thank you for tuning in. I am the Rogue Savage. Chelsea Manning has been the subject of long and tiresome debate for several years now, and has recently resurfaced in the mainstream media as President Obama, before finally leaving office, decided to commute her sentence. Her sentence now expiring May 17th. Many praise her as being a whistleblower. Others condemn her as being a traitor. Regardless of how you feel about her, several facts need to be taken into consideration. For starters, Chelsea Manning is a deeply disturbed individual, and granted, a lot of that can be attributed to her dysphoria. But even so, that does not excuse a lot of her actions, a lot of which can be traced as far back as her basic training days, where she was recycled for not meeting the standard. After basic, her record was marred by frequent outbursts of depression and anger to the point where her chain of command actually removed the bolt from her weapon because they feared that she would be a threat to herself and others. At one point, she even struck a female officer while deployed, causing Manning to lose rank and finally influence her chain of command to attempt to discharge her for failure to adapt. Now again, I can see a lot of these issues being attributed to her dysphoria, but that simply does not excuse such actions and events as punching one of her female officers. Keep in mind, all of this occurred well before the leaks even started. Now in 2010, Manning deployed to Iraq as an intel analyst, giving her access to an incredible amount of classified information. In that time, she leaked over 700,000 classified Iraq and Afghan war logs and diplomatic cables, including footage of an Apache attack helicopter titled Collateral Murder. Collateral Murder. I would like to show you exactly what I saw when I initially viewed this footage, and explain to you why that is completely bullshit. You can see what I mean even in the first minute of the video. I can actually see here people carrying weapons, for instance. Now, I do apologize, this picture is kind of grainy. That tends to happen when you're referencing black and white thermal imaging still shots. But anyway, if you look in the middle of the screen, you can see a group of people kind of milling about. In the video, they're actually walking, but in the person in the very top of the screen, you can see is actually carrying what appears to be an AK-47. The barrel is pointing to the ground, his hand is on the pistol grip, and the stock is more or less aligned with his forearm. Now, again, you can see this a little bit better when I actually start playing the video, but I just wanted to point these guys out first. God help me, I need Photoshop so I can freaking start drawing little circles in these pictures or something. But anyway, in this second picture, you can see it's really just a second or two apart from the first one. The individual standing right next to him is carrying what appears to be a long cylindrical object in his hand. That, to me, looks like a rocket-propelled grenade, or an RPG for short. Now, something you have to keep in mind, this is hardware that the average day-to-day Iraqi is not carrying around. The only people that's carrying around a rocket-propelled grenade in that time, in that place, is an insurgent looking to cause harm to Americans or other coalition personnel. Now here's the actual video. I'm not going to play the whole thing because you can actually see people getting killed in this video, and I'm just going to exclude that from the video. But coming up into our little group here, you can see the Apaches looking at everybody. Just a group milling around, people carrying objects. Can't really confirm or deny, really, that these guys are carrying weapons. Now, that individual that's getting pointed out is a journalist, as is he. But you can see them both carrying something at their sides, some sort of satchel or bag or something. Now, coming up behind them are the two guys carrying the AK-47 and the RPG. Okay, that's the guy up right there pointing out. Yep, right there. I mean, you can clearly see it, the AK and the RPG. Now, as the helicopter continues to turn around or circle around this building, you're going to see somebody crouching at the corner of this building here coming up and shoulders something large, something possibly tubular, maybe a little bit bigger than an RPG. It's kind of hard to tell. It could have been a camera, it could have been an RPG. Honestly, with this picture, it could go either way. Now, at that point in time, you can see, if you're reading the captions, that they finally got cleared hot to engage because they rightfully identified firearms. And that's where I'm going to stop. Now again, the reason why I stopped the video at that point is because shortly thereafter, the helicopters start engaging the group. It's a lot of carnage, and a lot of people die. It's probably a little bit too shocking for what I want to show, but if you really want to see it, I'll link the video in the description below. But anyway, basically what happens at that point, like I said, the helicopter starts shooting, people dying, and at one point, you actually see somebody in the sidewalk who's obviously hurt. They don't shoot him right away. The helicopter pilots can obviously see that he's unarmed. He's not really a threat, so they just keep their eye on him. But they have in their mind that this guy is an insurgent. Like I said before, the only people that's really carrying hardware like an RPG are people who want to do direct harm to American and coalition forces in Iraq at that time. These helicopter pilots have every reason to suspect that this journalist, and unfortunately he is a journalist, an innocent observer to all of this, he had every reason to believe that this guy was in league with these insurgents. Because, I mean, as you can see by the grainy quality of the video, you know, they're not exactly able to see the passport that each individual is carrying. But you can see the AK-47 and the rocket-propelled grenade in the video. Clear as day. Very shortly after the helicopters finish their engagement, that initial engagement rather, maybe within a minute or two of it, a van, unmarked van, pulls up next to the wounded journalist, and a couple guys get out, pick him up, and try to bring him into the van. Now, a couple things I have to point out here. Again, the van was unmarked. There was no way to differentiate whether or not these guys were insurgents or simple bystanders. Now, as it turns out, they were more than likely innocent bystanders, just trying to help. But this is a tactic that was very common amongst the enemy. They did not like leaving their guys behind. More often than not, you can still get some sort of intelligence off of a dead body. And obviously they want to, you know, possibly help the guy, and, you know, that way they can refield him. The helicopter calls up to his chain of command, permission to engage, and they are granted that permission, so they engage the van. You find out later in the video that there were civilians who were killed and injured, including 2 children. And unfortunately, the journalists died as well. But this brings me to a rather important point, an aspect of warfare that our troops, even today, have to face. People are very quick to point out, that this is murder, or what have you. And it is indeed a very tragic event. But there's a reason why American troops, or armies, around the world for that matter, wear uniforms to battle. Now granted, yes, our uniforms are camouflaged. It makes us a little bit harder to see. But nonetheless, there is a uniform. That uniform is meant to separate us, to differentiate us from the civilian populace, so that our enemies will be able to engage us apart from the civilians. And in doing so, hopefully reduce the amount of civilian casualties. Also, generally speaking, armies try to keep their battles outside of urban areas as much as possible, for that same reason. And there are actual rules of warfare that dictate this behavior, wearing uniforms, etc. And it is for that same purpose, to limit civilian casualties. That's something that separates us from the people that were fighting over there. These insurgents, for one, most of the time, the vast majority of the time, were not even Iraqis. They came into Iraq from elsewhere, whether that's Syria, Jordan, Iran, Saudi Arabia. And we know this. We know for a fact that these people came from the outside. Oftentimes we'd find passports still on their bodies. So, not only that, but they would oftentimes integrate themselves in with the civilian populace, not wearing any uniforms, and, well, basically just wearing everyday street clothes. But even still, they would engage us in these urban areas, looking like civilians, only really separating themselves apart by the weapons they carry. And sometimes they would just discard those weapons after the fight and blend right in. That's, a big part of the reason why we fought the majority of this war, and Afghanistan for that matter, in urban areas. Because in order for us to win this fight, we had to go in and get them. And unfortunately, yes, civilians got caught in the crossfire. And I don't want to downplay the tragedy of that. I mean, obviously, that's, a really tragic event. Like, I don't even know what to say about that. That sucks. I mean, 2 journalists died. 2 kids got severely wounded. I don't know if they survived. They got taken to a hospital. They were alive at the time. And beyond that, there's a possibility that other innocent people died as well. But the simple fact of the matter is, these people do not follow the rules of warfare. In fact, they will even go oftentimes as far as targeting civilians themselves. If anybody's ever watched American Sniper, those people that are drilling holes into people, literally, with power tools. That's something that actually happened often. And, I mean, not only that, but it was not at all uncommon for some insurgent to strap a suicide vest on a kid, tell them to go hug that American, and detonate from a distance. It wasn't unheard of for an insurgent to even detonate one of these bombs in a crowded area, such as, an outdoor market. They didn't care if civilians were involved or not. And really, that's why we did so well in the end. That's why we almost won. Because after a while, the tribal leaders in these areas of Iraq started to see that, yes, we were differentiating ourselves from the civilians. We did try to limit civilian casualties as much as possible, but these insurgents weren't. So that led to an uprising in Iraq that eventually drove these people out for the most part. That's why Al-Qaeda in Iraq, now currently referred to as ISIS, was defeated. And to be completely honest, it is because of our enemies' complete disregard for human life and their complete disregard for the rules of war. I'm personally in favor of keeping Guantanamo Bay open. It's for that reason. But that kind of leads me into another point. You see, it's oftentimes downplayed the fact that, these documents that were leaked were not held in the highest of classification levels. And they weren't. But some of them were classified as secret. And even though they were not classified top secret, which would have been the next classification and the final classification, even though they were still only classified as secret, does not mean that the potential was not there to endanger human life. In fact, government witnesses testified that the leaks endangered people who were named as information sources, prompting the State Department to help some of them move. And that right there illustrates exactly why we have a classification system in the first place. The reason why we keep secret information secret is to prevent certain people from getting exposed and possibly getting killed because this information was leaked out into the public and falling into enemy hands. Just because a document doesn't expose national security secrets causing, the nation to come out under harm doesn't mean that these leaks do not cause individuals harm. Now, interestingly, these documents which were leaked out to the public through Wikileaks exposed some corruption in places like Tunisia, which then in turn sparked a lot of protests and an overthrow of the government within Tunisia. And that in turn, some believe, sparked the Arab Spring, or at least helped facilitate that. Now, as it turns out, that was kind of a mixed bag. See, places like Tunisia and Egypt, although the revolution therein did end up overthrowing the government, Tunisia turned out relatively okay. Egypt was kind of a shit show at first, but they did seem to stabilize after the Muslim Brotherhood was taken out of office. But you also have places like Syria. I really don't think I have to talk too much about Syria. I'm pretty sure everybody knows at least the basics of what's going on in Syria right now. But beyond that, I mean, you also get a whole backstory behind, the guy that turned him in, and Wikileaks, and Julian Assange, and his complicated story, and it's really, this just turns into a giant fucking confusing mess. But in August of 2013, Manning was finally sentenced for violation of the Espionage Act, copying and disseminating classified military field reports, State Department cables, and assessments of detainees held in Guantanamo Bay. She was sentenced to 35 years in prison, which actually people make a pretty big deal about that. But when you take a look at the maximum for what she was eligible for, the maximum was 90 years. I mean, that's basically 1/3 of the sentence. And on top of that, being as she was treated fairly poorly when she was initially locked up, spending a lot of time in solitary confinement, many people believe for political reasons, the judge made her eligible for parole in 2013. So, essentially serving roughly 10 years after sentencing in total, and making her eligible to walk the streets thereafter as a relatively more or less free person. Although granted still on parole, but still. Now, what really bothers me about this case in particular is the massive amount of virtue signaling associated with it. There's a lot of people that claim that she was mistreated because of her dysphoria. The problem with that is nobody knew she was suffering from that until after she was sentenced. That's when she came out. Now, it is true that she was treated fairly poorly, and that helped influence her sentence. But that was purely for political reasons. There's no way they could have known that she was suffering from gender dysphoria. And a lot of that did have to do with don't ask, don't tell, but regardless. The truth of the matter is, she was a weak-minded individual. Again, gender dysphoria does not excuse punching out a superior officer, among many, many other things. She put lives in danger by distributing this information into the public. She degraded public trust in the government, which, I mean, let's be honest, the government didn't really need any help with that to begin with. But she also degraded public trust in the military, who really wasn't doing anything wrong for the most part. Not to mention, she also degraded international trust between the United States and our allies. And of course, she broke the law. Now, I have no doubt that her intentions were good. I have no reason to believe otherwise. But as they say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And her intentions simply do not excuse her actions. But anyway, that's all I have for today. Thanks again for tuning in. If you like what I do, please like, share, subscribe. Please check out my Patreon. And I'll see you next time. Savage out.